blessed. You got a lot going.
Aha. Another important way to think about culture is how we acquire culture. And there are two important concepts I want to introduce to you: socialization and acculturation. So, socialization, as the term implies, means that we are socialized, that we are socially learners of a culture, versus acculturation, to acquire a culture, to enter a cultural space that is different from yours. One way that I like to think about this is language. Language is, of course, one way that we represent culture, and one way that we can see cultures differ, cultures overlap, cultures have similarities and even differences that have much deeper meanings than what the words actually mean. And so the language that I'm speaking to you now is what's called my native tongue, or my maternal language. It's the language I learned from my mother. English, American English. We come from the American South, and so even regionally, you know that there are ways of speaking and values behind those ways of speaking, not least of which is the so-called Southern drawl. We speak slowly, and we speak so-called politely, the Southern politesse. Behind this, of course, is the idea of indirect communication, the ability and the desire to say something indirectly, and yet that's truthful. Now, this may seem like beating around the bush as you begin to cross cultural lines. So when we think about acculturation, we also want to think about ways that we learn to communicate in different ways. But again, go back to language. I acquired French as a foreign language. It means I learned to speak French not from a means of socialization, but specifically in a classroom with grammar drilled, conjugating verbs, learning to pronounce vowels and nouns differently and say words differently than I do in my own language. And of course, those of us who have learned and acquired a second language also know that the way that we speak in a second language is often different from how we speak in our native languages. First of all, we know that there are different ways of saying things, both directly and indirectly, that we quickly discover across languages. Now, I mentioned language as a way to instantiate or to represent culture because, again, I go back to understanding culture as different processes of acquiring culture. I acquired, or I was acculturated into French as a language, but specifically when I began to master French was when I studied French abroad as a student, and then later as a Peace Corps volunteer in West Africa, in French-speaking West Africa, where I lived amongst native speakers and used French and later Bambara as a means of being, and not just communicating, but acquiring my basic needs: food, housing, and working with others. How can our understanding of acculturation and socialization combined with our understanding of language help us understand both processes of learning and understanding what culture is and how cultures may differ and how these differences in culture may cause conflict? But our ability to be culturally competent also implies that we are able to acculturate ourselves into different ways of communicating, not least of which is being aware of these cultural differences.
For you.